And
Yeah.
it's a Twitter exchange about like what to do next, of like what the next step of tech career. And I kind of assumed, the reason why I never would have considered giving a talk like this previously is I assume that people that regularly attend hackathons and people that are part of MLH just sort of know about this stuff from the nature of going to hackathons, and it seems like the reality is actually not a great deal that it, practically in the actual commercial world of working as a career in tech, that how you apply lots of things like this and what roles actually look like can be a bit of a mystery. So I'll just give a quick background to me. Hello, I'm Jim Seconde. I'm a developer advocate for a small agency in Birmingham in the UK. I'm originally from PHP land. I started learning, I only know modern PHP, so all of the jokes that you've heard about it are not actually applicable, and it looks more like Java these days, and there's nothing wrong with it. I started learning that off the back of going to meetups only, which I think really in about 2014 was probably the skills and the networking that you get from going to meetups like that have mainly been replaced probably by MLH and hackathons, I think personally. But that was where I just went to it because I just thought I need to learn something and I want to be a software developer, let's just go. And I ended up meeting some of the sharpest sort of minds in their field of software development, and I was generally quite surprised. And they're also very open, you can just chat to them. And then I started learning to do this as a job, to be a developer, and then I bought all those books behind me, and it turns out you can meet all the people that wrote those books and discuss problems because they're really open to it. So the world of the world of networking and the community you get in tech sometimes is absolutely incredible. Sometimes it's awful, but that's definitely not a conversation for now. That's getting involved in things like open source software, which it can be generally quite terrifying, especially if you fire up the trolls. So I'm gonna split this into sort of two bits really, of two main areas of defined roles within tech that fall into are in high demand, and for the moment will always be in high demand, and the background to why those roles exist and how you can prepare from a hackathon perspective, why you're well prepared for it. Some of you are well prepared already, and I think the context of why those roles exist is quite important, because in the world of software development being web development, really, I mean, now if you talk about software development, it means web development because of how much it's sort of taken over, and software as a service is now a complete thing. If you build an app, it's available via HTTPS anywhere, right? That's how you build an app. With the advent of that and lots of crazy innovation, like taking JavaScript's engine V8 out of a browser, putting it onto a back-end server, then back-end servers becoming virtualized, and then infrastructure as code becoming a thing, and then AWS exploding, and then now all server infrastructure is all virtual. A lot of these things have happened where people that are already in the industry have just seen the development and they understand the concepts that underlie them. From anyone that comes into the industry new, there are lots and lots of really weird old quirks about what that technology does, and you need to really, sometimes it's very, very useful to know the story behind some of that. So the story behind DevOps, just for a bit of interaction, because although this is a sort of a talk, it's supposed to be a bit of a discussion as really. Has everybody heard of DevOps or knows about it? Just check the chat. Okay, heard of it. Okay. Okay, cool. DevOps, in the beginning, let's go from the beginning. It stands for developer operations. So in the old days, you've got two roles. You've got a developer. That's very, very obvious. That's the developer sits in front of a computer screen and they write application code. Or because we're going back some, let's say like database programmer or DBA, like database administrator, they write lots of SQL. That's one role. And then you have ops. And operations are your old-fashioned IT people who are in charge of servers and sit usually stereotypically in the basement of a building. If anyone has seen the British show, the IT Crowd, it used to be exactly like that. And that's infrastructure, networking, like a lot of Ethernet stuff, a lot of hardware hacking and things like that. So, as I explained, the reason why DevOps came to be is because those lines started becoming extremely blurred with the advancement of virtual platforming and virtualization. Originally, virtualization was, I can mock this machine and stream it like from a server somewhere to here. Or I can use an emulator to emulate a machine. But as technology advanced, suddenly it became very quickly industry standard to be able to host an entire networking stack completely virtually. And that would happen on AWS or Google Cloud or DigitalOcean or any number of things like that. And that really sort of, when that happened, everyone realized that the industry had completely changed, because you could get developers that could write application code, and they could also write a YAML file which defined an entire structure of how that application should be hosted on the cloud, and then push it up into source control, and then it would deploy everything. And once you've got that, you realize that developers and operations are now becoming the same kind of thing. So DevOps has really sort of taken off, and now I would say is an industry norm. Where it really starts coming into its own is it's now replacing traditional development in a lot of ways. And there are two main ways that's being driven, and there's two main pieces of technology that are doing it. The two main ways that it's being done are event-driven architecture and microservices. And the two technologies that underline and underpin all of that are Docker and Kubernetes, which you might have come across or used in hackathons, but that's containerization and container orchestration. So event-driven architecture really is redefining what it means to be a developer, because originally a developer in Java, in Python, using something like Django, would write application code, right? And it would be on what was called a monolith. It would have like, here is the front end, here is the back end, here are the tests, this is how the code looks. And then you'd have a server that hosts it. With the advent of containers and with small virtual instances in AWS, people started realizing that you could actually split out the application logic into tiny bits of containers scattered all over your AWS or DigitalOcean architecture. And as AWS moved with that, they realized that they could introduce new services that could cope with this new way of working. So imagine in the old world, you're writing an API and you're writing it in Flask in Python, and you would write the application logic and it would say, here is a post or here is a get endpoint, and it will take this request and then it will do some stuff in some procedural Python code, and then it will give a reply. So, and that would be as part of your main application. With event-driven architecture, you're not actually doing it in one centralized place at all. You're doing something, you start doing really, really mad things. So what it would look like is, here comes the request into the API. Now, I'm going to take what you sent me and I'm going to fire it off to AWS's event-driven architecture system that I built, and it's going to spin up a tiny little bit of Django on its own server, try and do something, and then kill that server. It's going to be a server that exists for 0.3 seconds. And it's that is going to cope with the load. The reason why that changes absolutely everything, for instance, is instead of that bit of code that you've got in a central repository trying to handle, say you've got one request, it handles the request and it gives the reply. Okay, that's what your code does. What happens when 1 million people hit that at once? And the answer is your code falls over because it can't deal with that many requests. It can only deal with 10 per second. If your code is actually firing off via these containers into event-driven architecture that you've written, just for anyone taking notes, it's AWS Lambdas is what we're talking here, where a Lambda, being traditionally an anonymous function, is actually a chunk of anonymous function code that's now on its own mini server, on its own instance. So instead of, if you hit that piece of code with 10 million requests, it will fire off 10 million Lambdas, and it doesn't care what happens once it's fired them off, because it'll have to deal with them when they come back, when they go back to the user. That kind of level of structure is redefining how we look at applications and how we're programming. That's where DevOps comes into things as a discipline. So that's kind of the background of it. The kind of skills that you're required, that are required really in DevOps are, it makes it very interesting because you don't level up in one particular language. Like if you're a senior Python developer, if you want to move into DevOps, you can do, but your role will be redefined in your thinking or how you approach a problem of whether you're adding a caching layer onto something, whether you're using Redis for that caching layer, or whether you're going to use lambdas for this function, or whether, like, to do anonymous stuff all over AWS, or whether you're going to keep some of the code centralized and it's actually going to be in a monolith. This is the kind of things that you have to approach from a DevOps perspective. From what you see in hackathons, you'll start, depending on the kind of language you're writing in, or whether you're writing Node, JavaScript, or Python, or something like that, you'll probably come across things that people have in DevOps, like problems that people encounter in DevOps quite a lot. Because of the nature of hackathons, you're just building something from scratch for fun. In order to host it, you might use something quick, like I think a lot of hackathons, I see a lot of people using Netlify and a lot of Heroku and things like that to deploy an application in production and to be in charge of how that pipeline works, and the fact that it's going to deploy using Heroku, that is a DevOps decision. That's what DevOps engineers do. So you're already part of the way looking at the kind of role that's defined. Another massive thing apart from infrastructure as code are pipelines and continuous integration, which actually, when I was just sort of chatting to Will just before we started, is now really key to every modern business should be, every modern tech business should be doing this now as standard. In the old days when you're building a pipeline, what this sort of means is I'm writing an application in PHP. Let's say I'm using like something, let's say something quite old-fashioned like WordPress. When I make a change, I make changes to the code on my computer, and then I use an FTP server to send it up to a server that's usually a physical box somewhere that's on some shared hosting platform, and then it moves the file up, and then because the new file is there on the live server, the change has taken place. So that's a classic old school way of doing it. In the DevOps world, this has been completely transformed with infrastructure as code and with pipelines, because we have continuous integration. And if you want to go into a career in tech and you want to get involved in DevOps, understanding how continuous integration works really is quite a key skill. So much like DevOps problems that you get, it's how you approach a problem. And the problem involves many moving parts, like application logic, hosting, code, tests, how the source code works. All of these are you'd be day to day from a DevOps perspective. You'd be looking at, maybe we should change this server out to this service or something like that. And pipelines are an example of a pipeline. Is I think the best example is what I've been working on this afternoon. In the PHP application that I am writing for at the moment, it is open source. You can have a look at it. It's called Order, and it's an open source ordering system, which is written in Laravel. We have a number of services in the code base that are as configuration files that then trigger a pipeline. So there's DevOps practices involved in that application as our sort of day-to-day developer our day-to-day developer life. So if I take a piece of code and I need to make a feature from it, or I need to let's say like today I've been working on a new API endpoint. So I write the API endpoint in the code, introduce new sort of routes. So if you do a GET request with this, blah blah blah, it does this. The important thing that's happening in the background with DevOps is when I push that in Git, because it's on GitHub, like all good software, we have a centralized repository of the code, so you can have a look at. It's an open source project, so you can have a look. When you try and commit onto that, and you try and push it to the server, a number of things happen. First of all, 2 quality control tools run in PHP, in Docker, locally on your computer where you're developing on, to make sure that you're not pushing up something that's majorly breaking. And so you can't even modify the actual base code in on GitHub unless it passes those tests first. So that's kind of like, it traps things before they happen. Another good DevOps one is the standards. So commit messages on GitHub have to follow a structure. They need to look like this because we need standards. If they don't adhere to that standards, the way we've done it from a DevOps perspective is it won't accept it. So it stops. Once you do push it, there is a load of configuration code for Circle CI, which is our continuous integration tool. And what that does is a load of predefined stuff on a server on Circle CI to make sure that what you've pushed, it's got past the first stage, but now it's got to do a load of other stuff. So it'll do a load of other PHP stuff, like it will get dependencies. Let's say this is Composer, so it's PHP, but if you code day-to-day in Node JavaScript, it will be NPM. If you do Python, it will be pip. If you do Ruby, it will be gem. It runs all that, gets all the dependencies, and then runs all of our custom unit tests that we've built. We've done loads and loads of tests. If that fails, Circle CI will reply and then cancel it and say you can't push this up because the tests are failing. So this is all the kind of stuff that has come out of the DevOps world, engineering world. It's approaching problems by approaching things from a platform perspective. As an aside to that, as like a sort of an extra, and to throw things and confuse people even more, something new has been sort of cropping up, and I really do see this as a bonus, and I really see the benefit of creating a new term. The world of tech, unfortunately, is absolutely stacked full of acronyms and terms. I would say try not to use too many of them because it normally implies that people know what you're talking about. Like, for instance, at the moment, I'm just firing a load of spiel off to you, and you might not understand a lot of things, but it's quite important to try and approach things from a bit of a perspective of assuming that the other person doesn't have that knowledge. So when you do like AWS Lightsail, and then we use Fargate and blah blah, because there's so many terms, just be quite sort of wary about that. But this term, I do think, is actually quite a good logical term. It's mainly come from a security agency called F5, who recently have become quite a big player in tech because they bought the company Nginx that run the world's now most popular application server, which has overtaken Apache, which is old-fashioned now. Sorry, Apache. And a UK company called Snyk, who are security companies that are modern new security companies that have come into being really from the DevOps space, knowing that because the world has changed in application development on the web and everything is virtualized, if everything is virtualized and we use Docker for images and we use Kubernetes for orchestration of images, who is considering security during all of this? And at this point, it's become a famous kind of, it's a famous joke, and it really is true, that if you want to get an application to a minimum viable product state, like the minimum we need to do to ship this product is it needs this feature, this feature, this feature, it needs some logins and blah, blah, blah. And you write all of it and then you ship it all and you host it on AWS or DigitalOcean or something like that. And security is absolutely the last thing that you consider thinking about. And it's still true. And a lot of developers really will just go, oh, well, the classic thing they say is we'll deal with the security later. With the advent of things like Kubernetes and with container orchestration, companies like Snyk have realized that really there's no reason why we shouldn't do security first. And it's true. So DevOps is now kind of being enhanced to a new term that I think should be the industry standard, to DevSecOps, which is developer security operations. So now your role is defined as you're a developer in usually multiple languages. You do ops in that you know about continuous integration, you know about pipelines, you know about container orchestration, you know about virtualized server hosting, and also you know about security. And security from a perspective now of using your security as part of your pipeline. So a really good example of this is I took you through a pipeline that I've been working day to day, when it goes off and it runs the automated tests in JavaScript, and then it runs the automated tests in PHP on the server. Are we all good for that? Can we ship? Okay, good. Does it meet all of our code standards? Now we add an extra step, and the extra step is if we run this through a third-party security service like Snyk, is the application logic secure? So that's introducing security into your operations. That's all of that. I've managed to use up 24 minutes of that, which is a miracle, because I did not come to talk about DevOps, because that's not what I do. I just have to do it day to day as part of my job a little bit. I do developer relations. So this again is is a fairly modern explosion of something that existed before. Like I said, it's interesting. It's useful for people to get a little bit of prior knowledge as to why something exists. So, for developer relations, and the people that practice developer relations are developer advocates. So I'm a developer advocate. Originally comes from the world of developer evangelism. So back in the day, in the 90s, if you had Microsoft SQL Server or the new version of Windows, how do you promote that? The way you promote that is you get your marketing team to do it, because it's a product. And so what would happen is big tech conferences would happen, and somebody would go on stage that would be from IBM or Red Hat Linux or something like that, and they'd say, hey, we've got this new thing, and we're going to do a Steve Ballmer from Microsoft where we get really sweaty on stage and get really enthusiastic about the product. The important thing about that world is that those developer evangelists were people like Steve Jobs and Steve Ballmer. They were evangelists, they were product people, they were marketing people. And marketing to developers doesn't work because they hate it. And that is a universal truth. And that really explains why developer relations kind of came to be. So here is a bit of background about what developer relations is now and why it is the way it is and how that role came to be. Evolving from developer evangelism, if you take a modern company, let's say, off the top of my head, logs.io or Datadog or New Relic or Twilio. These are all companies. Some of these services you may have used, you may have mucked around with as part of hackathons. Things like Twilio or Nexmo or Vonage, as it's now known, are used regularly in hackathons because it's an SMS service, so it's fun to play around with. And also, those people are very hot on hiring, so they actually turn up to hackathons to sponsor them because they want people to use their products. So those companies, from a modern perspective, realize that the people that use their products, their customers, are only developers. And if your customers are only developers, you need to be marketing to them without marketing. You need to be a developer yourself. You need to be an engineer that uses and writes this and understands software in order to be able to get people that also use software and will possibly use your product on board. That is really the kind of crux of where developer relations came to be. And how it's defined is loosely defined is this, because developer relations is different for every company. It's normally defined into about four main kind of pillars of areas. So one of them is developer outreach, and that is developer outreach really is going to conferences and speaking at conferences and networking at conferences, because really in order to be a developer advocate, you need to get into the ecosystems of you need to be in the ecosystems of people that will consume your product. So for, let's say, Twilio, they have developer advocates on the ground in various ecosystems. There are people that know the PHP ecosystem well. There are people that know the Python community well, because they need to connect with the people in those individual areas, because Twilio is an API platform. Anyone can use it. So it doesn't matter whether you're a Python programmer, you're a Ruby programmer, anyone can use it, right? So from that perspective, it's kind of key to get outreach and to get the word out about your product. And if you're going to do that, say at conferences, you need to be looking at speaking. And if you're speaking, your hard skills from that are, you're usually already a developer. You're not a marketer. You're a developer. You know the struggles of what it's like to be a software developer. You can develop yourself. You need to be a good public speaker and be, well, you don't have to. Well, I'd say you have to be, but and loosely entertaining or engaging from that perspective. From the kind of support that my company and the meetup that I co-run called Fusion, we are quite big on making sure that attendees at hackathons do looking at public speaking, because it gets your name out there, it gets people engaged and talking about the work that you're doing. It's pretty cool. That's one pillar. Second pillar of developer relations is education, and education is massive, because the people that are going to consume your product now are other developers. And if your product is an API, then you need to write decent documentation about your API. You need to be almost documentation first. You need to your API needs to have decent tutorials. It needs to have amazing docs. If you want to see, very, very tragically, a DevRel program that has just been completely shut down because 250 people have been sacked from it, probably the best developer documentation in the world is the Mozilla Developer Network. That is their DevRel department writing those docs, and the web's APIs and how browsers work and how JavaScript works. That's pretty much a team of people involved in developer education and DevRel. So that's a pretty key area, and that means that the skills that you require to be good at DevRel branch into what you do experience at hackathons quite a lot. So being engaging at technical writing, being good at writing blog posts, making sure, this is what Will and I were talking about just beforehand, making sure that if you write a blog post for Medium, but don't use Medium, if you write a blog post for dev.to, or you write a blog post for another platform, then instead of just doing an article about here's how I did something and here's the code, make it more engaging. And being a good technical writer is very good for developer relations, because it creates it gives good feedback and good engagement, because people look at it and go, well, actually, that was a really good article. Oh, actually, maybe I should try this product. So that's pretty key. More of a big company, big tech companies and big outreach have this as a pillar as DevRel. Product feedback. The primary face of that product, if you're in their developer relations, if you're in their team or you're a developer advocate, is for some people who use it and you've established a one-to-one network with them, other developers that are going to be using your product, you are going to be their primary source of feedback from the product perspective. So as part of DevRel, you also need to be quite good at taking product feedback. When someone says the API is broken, it doesn't do this. In an old world, you go to tech support, but with the advent of DevRel, there are new avenues of getting back that feedback. So you can actually sit in between feedback from the end users and the actual product people who make design decisions about how the product works. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look at the fourth pillar, because I've forgotten. Community. Community is kind of key. Community differs from outreach. With outreach, I've been talking about conference speaking and pitching to conferences, learning how to public speak and things like that. For community, really, this is being a developer in a community of other developers, and it's key. It's very important to be part of the community, because you understand how other developers work, because if you're going to sort of market to them as a developer to developer and like a one-to-one relationship, you need to understand how their community works. You need to understand how open source software works, and open source software is something for another day, but that is a huge kind of pillar and comes into a lot of the work that a lot of the kind of experimenting that you'll be coming across in hackathons and the toys that you'll be playing with. But it's kind of important that you're a community member, because from a product and business perspective, if you're DevRel and you're talking on stage, for a lot of people, you are actually the face of that company. So there's a bit of PR involved in that. And that bit comes into the sort of outreach, but being the facing part of a company or technology comes with responsibility. And that's where community comes in. If you are not a responsible member of your community, in 2021, terms like cancel culture and things like that have become quite mainstay, but also people are now speaking out about this now. If you're a horrible human being and you make it known on Twitter, word gets around. And if you are the face of a particular technology, or even worse, if that particular technology is a business and you're in that business, you're going to be in hot water very, very quickly, because you need to be responsible. You need to be with the times with these things, and you need to have empathy and understanding if you're going to outreach to people. This is why I think hackathon culture, this comes into it quite a lot, because in hackathon culture you have code of conduct, you have safeguarding, because this is the same kind of crossover you get in meetups. And if you're going to be the face of companies, you need to be understanding of that. There's a lot of crossover with DevRel, really, when it comes to meetups and things like that, because to run a successful meetup, really, you do need to have safeguarding and you do need to have a code of conduct. So there's a lot of kind of crossover. The final kind of thing to stay on this, because we're at 35 minutes, really is the reason why I'm doing this talk and I'm pitching this talk, is there is a lot of crossover between hackathon culture and DevRel, and it's very obvious. If I can think of quite a lot of people off the top of my head, I'm actually, just to save sort of face for them, I'm not going to name them, but I can think of about maybe 10 people off the top of my head whose careers have come straight from hackathons and winning prizes at hackathons, or helping to run hackathons, or writing code of conduct, or hackathons, or doing or safeguarding or something like that, have come off the back of that into developer relations, because the companies that have DevRel first strategies understand that that is the best hunting ground to actually look. So as fellows, as part of MLH, I would encourage you to have a look if it's something that you would be interested in. It is not, I'm not going to push it as like it's a definite be on and end all. It's because it's not for everyone. Public speaking isn't for everyone. It can be quite stressful. But you get a lot of crossover with DevRel. I don't have a computer science degree. I have a theatre degree. I'm an actor, which is why that crossover between tech and theatre works really quite well. But it's not for everyone. But if you do want to go in that avenue, it's heavily in demand. It's paid extremely well. It is extremely hard to get into, unfortunately, but there is a very good network of people, of industry leaders in the world of developer relations that would be willing to mentor and help you out, because it is something that, I mean, look at the COVID crisis that is happening at the moment. The world of tech is exploding in such a way where tech first and remote working is becoming a thing. That means, not surprisingly, in terms of world of big tech and international tech, DevRel is almost not really slowing down that much. In fact, what is happening is DevRel is more in demand because conferences and networking has been taken away. So suddenly the world of DevRel has had to explode, and suddenly they're like, okay, how do we now make everything virtual? How do we make our conferences virtual? So anyway, that is a massive non-stop for air 38-minute talk on the world of DevOps, DevSecOps, and DevRel. Thank you very much for listening, and thanks for inviting me to talk for MLH.